I will start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Ladies and gentlemen, honorable adjudicators, members of the House, and our fellow debaters that I respected today. Ladies and gentlemen, at the core of this debate isn't debating about whether social progress is important or not, because of course it is important, right? But the real question that comes into our mind is whether society should have sacrificed deeply rooted cultural identities, their communal stability, and the indigenous authority in the name of rapid modernization. Ladies and gentlemen, as the proposition, we believe that modernization shouldn't mean forcing communities to abandon systems that have sustained. It doesn't mean that they have to lose their identity, their social cohesion, and survival generation that have been held for thousands of years. Ladies and gentlemen, our stances today for today's debate is simple because cultural preservation isn't the enemy of progress at all, but we believe that sustainable progress can only exist when communities are allowed to develop without losing the foundation of who they are, of their identity. Ladies and gentlemen, let's move on to our first argument, that is cultural identity is irreplaceable. Ladies and gentlemen, as we all know, cultural identity is the foundation of the identity and social stability in the people that believe in it. Ladies and gentlemen, the reason of this, that this is not just solely an old practices, but traditional activities, also beliefs also contains in collective memory, values, social structures, and the historical identity that cannot be replaced or rebuilt once it lost. Ladies and gentlemen, in reality, modernization often creates cultural homogenizations where smaller indigenous communities slowly lose their language, their ceremonies, and their own several communities. And ladies and gentlemen, as the concrete example, our national principle itself, Bhinneka Tunggal Ika, already emphasized on how our country should have protected and remain the existency of the cultural heritage in the middle of diversity. Ladies and gentlemen, our cultural heritage itself, as what I have said before, isn't just an old practices, but also contains good and values that is special, unique, and also exceptional. Ladies and gentlemen, for the example, right now, such as batik that I wore today is a form of protecting my own cultural heritage, and I'm proud of it. And also, it gives me an identity that is exceptional and unique when I wore it, right? And also, we can also take advantage actually from the globalization to promote this kind of cultural heritage, and we can give the combination between cultural heritage and also the social progress. Ladies and gentlemen, in today's motion itself, in Kairan, in the community of Kairan, the cultural system that have been offered to us ensure the younger generation to learn oral history, traditional conflict resolution, local craftsmen, and the intangible cultural heritage that cannot be replaceable. That without the system, cultural heritage can be disappear within only 1 or 2 generations in the future, isn't it? And also, ladies and gentlemen, with this kind of cultural heritage, we can still ensure the economical and social growth. Why? Because in Aruna Island, with this kind of cultural heritage, they actually can grow more uniqueness and create a branding that cannot be replicated. This can actually give more chances to be more recognizable rather than any other island, because of their strong cultural identity. Ladies and gentlemen, this kind of logic is completely realistic because it actually have been amplified by the people in Baduy tribes in Indonesia, in our country, where they're actually strong in culture but still have the profits by it and save their own cultural heritage. It can also create an economical growth with the culture such as Subak in Bali, which can ensure our agriculture growth in our country. Ladies and gentlemen, let's move on into our second argument, that is rapid social progress can destabilize the indigenous communities. Why? Because reform such as individual island ownership, unrestricted urbanization, and also it can also weakening the community authority fundamentally because they change how community organize the social life and how the community organize their economy life. Ladies and gentlemen, the real evidence for this is in Papua itself, in our country, that the people have their traditional land rights exploited and get changed to be an oil palm fields by the governance to create a biodiesel industries for advantaging some sort of exclusive people. Ladies and gentlemen, this created of system doesn't have the agreement of the people at all, because they actually have protested by creating 1,800 Red Cross to actually symbolize the protesters and an agreement from for this kind of modernization and system that government have made. Ladies and gentlemen, this also leads us into our third argument, that is a true progress should have respect indigenous autonomy and authority. Ladies and gentlemen, we all know and believe, right, that if a country lose their culture, they also means that they're losing their own identity. Ladies and gentlemen, not all modernization automatically represent improvement for everyone, isn't it? For the people who believe in their culture and want to help their culture strong, with this kind of modernization that is forcing them to change or rebuild their own identity, this means that this is disadvantaging them, right? And also, because of that, ladies and gentlemen, this also means that wanting to keep our culture doesn't mean to avoid the social progress at all, because we can still combine it with the knowledge that is necessary, doesn't against our culture, and can eventually grow our own culture and human resources. Ladies and gentlemen, at the end of the day, society shouldn't be forced to choose between dignity and modernization, but therefore, sustainable progress should have empowered communities while still preserving the cultural foundation that define who they are. And ladies and gentlemen, with this kind of harm rather than goods that the modernization gave to us, I'm 100% proud to be a proposition. Thank you.